John Carter stood in the grand hall of the Xalorian palace, his human heart pounding against his ribs. The air smelled of exotic spices and strange metals. The towering walls glowed with veins of pulsing blue light. Hundreds of Xalorian nobles, warriors, and scholars lined the vast chamber, their alien eyes fixed on him with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a massive throne adorned with floating crystals, was the Queen of Xaloria herself. She was unlike anything John had ever seen. Her skin shimmered in hues of deep violet, shifting under the light as though woven from the cosmos itself. Long silver hair cascaded over armored shoulders, her golden eyes radiating authority. A crown of delicate but razor-sharp metal curved around her forehead. John had been sent as part of a diplomatic delegation, meant to establish peace between humanity and the Xalorian Empire after years of uneasy tension. He had spent weeks studying their customs, learning the intricacies of their formalities, and yet, standing before the Queen, he felt entirely unprepared. A hush fell over the chamber as the Queen rose to her feet. Her gaze was steady, unreadable. John swallowed hard. This was it, the moment that would determine humanity's future in this region of space. He had been instructed to show respect, to be cautious, and to follow the traditions precisely. One wrong move could undo everything. The Queen lifted a hand, signaling for him to speak. He took a breath and stepped forward, careful to avoid any gestures that could be misinterpreted. He had rehearsed his lines 100 times, but his nerves made his throat dry. He decided to keep it simple. "Your Majesty," he said, inclining his head slightly, "on behalf of the United Earth Coalition, I bring greetings and goodwill. It is our hope that a lasting peace can be forged between our people." The Queen tilted her head, watching him carefully. Silence stretched between them, thick with expectation. John hesitated. He had been told that body language played a huge role in Xalorian diplomacy. A respectful bow, a raised hand, a precise movement, it all carried meaning. He couldn't afford to get this wrong. He glanced briefly at one of the human envoys at his side, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Trusting his instincts, John placed his right hand over his chest, then extended his left in what he hoped was a neutral gesture of goodwill. It was meant to symbolize sincerity and unity, a gesture used across many human cultures. The reaction was instant. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Xalorian nobles murmured, warriors stiffened, and the Queen's golden eyes widened ever so slightly. John felt a prickle of unease crawl down his spine. Something was wrong. Whispers spread like wildfire, a low hum of shock moving through the gathered assembly. A Xalorian official stepped forward hastily, his expression somewhere between horror and disbelief. He turned to the Queen and spoke in a hushed but urgent tone. John's mind raced. What had he done? Had he insulted her? Was this some forbidden gesture? He opened his mouth to explain, to clarify that he meant no offense, but before he could speak, the Queen herself raised a hand, silencing the room. She took a step down from her throne, her gaze locked onto his, searching. The moment stretched impossibly long, each second dragging like a weight against his chest. Then, in a voice both regal and edged with something dangerous, she spoke. "You propose an alliance in the old way," she said, her voice carrying through the hall like a blade slicing through silence. John blinked. The old way. He wasn't sure what she meant. He was about to ask when the Queen's lips curved into something resembling amusement. Though there was something else there too, something deeper. "Do you understand what you have done, human?" she asked. John swallowed hard. The weight of 100 gazes pressed down on him, waiting for his response. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever he had just done had not been a simple diplomatic gesture. Before he could answer, one of the Xalorian nobles stepped forward. He was tall, imposing, with dark metallic armor that reflected the chamber's strange light. His voice was deep and firm. "The human has followed the sacred tradition," he announced. "He has honored the Queen with the proposal of kings." John's stomach dropped. The proposal of kings. Murmurs grew louder. The queen studied him for a moment longer before turning to the gathered assembly. It has been generations since a proposal was made in such a way, she mused, and never before by an outsider. John felt a trickle of sweat at the base of his neck. Wait, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. The queen lifted a hand again, cutting him off. There is no misunderstanding, human. You have spoken in a language of old customs, and by our laws, I must answer. The hall fell into absolute silence. Then she turned her golden gaze back to him, a small smile playing at her lips. I accept your proposal, she said. John's mind short-circuited. The words didn't register at first. But as the room erupted into a mixture of cheers and exclamations of shock, he realized the weight of what had just happened. He had, unknowingly, just proposed marriage to the most powerful ruler in the Xalorian Empire. And now, by their law, he was her future king. His stomach dropped. Oh, crap. John stood frozen in place, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The Queen of Xaloria had accepted his so-called proposal, and now an entire alien court was hailing him as the future king. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the moment crashed down on him like a collapsing starship. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't some misunderstanding that could be laughed off. This was a binding agreement, sealed in front of hundreds of witnesses, and by the way the Xalorian nobles and warriors were looking at him, some with admiration, others with barely concealed hostility. He knew there was no easy way out. John opened his mouth to protest, to explain that it had been a mistake, but before he could say a word, two towering Xalorian guards in gleaming obsidian armor stepped forward. Their reptilian features were sharp and unreadable, their eyes glowing a faint green. One of them spoke in a deep, commanding voice. The Queen's betrothed must be prepared for the path of kings. The path of kings. That did not sound good. John glanced toward the human diplomats standing at the far end of the hall, their faces just as stunned as his. He tried to step back, to shake his head, but the guards closed in, motioning for him to follow. The Queen remained silent, watching him with an unreadable expression. Then, in a fluid motion, she turned and strode from the chamber, her long silver cape billowing behind her. The guards nudged him forward, and with no other choice, John followed. The corridor beyond the throne room was vast and otherworldly, lined with columns that pulsed with a faint golden light. Strange holographic symbols hovered in the air, shifting as they walked past. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Listen, he said, addressing the guards. There's been a huge mistake. I'm just a diplomat. I didn't mean to propose to your queen. The guards didn't even acknowledge his words. They marched forward with perfect discipline, leading him through a series of twisting halls and towering archways until they'd reached a massive set of doors. One of them raised a hand, and the doors slid open with a deep hiss, revealing an opulent chamber beyond. The room was unlike anything John had ever seen. The ceiling was a vast dome of swirling starlight, as if the very cosmos had been captured within. The walls shimmered with intricate carvings that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the chamber was a raised platform, adorned with ceremonial armor, weapons, and ancient-looking relics. And standing at the far end of the room, waiting for him, was the Queen. She turned as he entered, her golden eyes studying him once more. The doors slid shut behind him, sealing them in. John's pulse quickened. "We need to talk," he said immediately, stepping forward. "I didn't mean to propose to you. I swear it was a misunderstanding." The Queen raised a delicate brow. "Do you truly believe that matters?" John hesitated. Yes." A faint, amused smile touched her lips, but there was something else in her gaze, something sharper, more calculating. She stepped closer, her movements impossibly graceful. "The laws of my people are absolute," she said. "A royal proposal, once made, cannot be undone. To break it would be a grave dishonor, and the consequences would be severe." John swallowed hard. What kind of consequences? She tilted her head slightly. For you? Exile at best. Execution at worst. For me? Her gaze darkened. It would be seen as weakness, an act that would invite civil war among the noble houses. John felt the blood drain from his face. So what you're saying is, if I refuse to go along with this, people might actually die. The Queen nodded. Yes, many. John ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. This was insane. He had come here to negotiate trade agreements, to talk about diplomacy and peace, not to accidentally start an interstellar war because of an awkward hand gesture. There has to be a way out of this, he muttered. The Queen's gaze remained steady. There is one way. John perked up. Really? She stepped even closer until there were only inches between them. Up close, he could see the faint glow of her skin, the ethereal beauty that made her seem almost unreal. You must prove yourself worthy, she said. John blinked. Worthy of what? She gestured toward the ceremonial platform behind her. The path of kings is a series of trials, a test of strength, intelligence, and loyalty. If you fail, you will be deemed unworthy of the throne, and the engagement will be nullified. John exhaled, relief washing over him. Great, that sounds manageable. I just have to fail a few tests, right? No problem. The Queen's lips curved into a knowing smile. There is one complication. John's stomach twisted. Of course there is. If you fail too quickly or too easily, it will be seen as cowardice. Her gaze hardened. And cowards do not leave this planet alive. John's mouth went dry. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. I have to take part in these trials, but if I fail in a way that looks too weak, I die. The Queen nodded. Correct. John let out a shaky breath. Fantastic. Just fantastic. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Do you wish to proceed? Did he have a choice? John sighed, rubbing his temples. Yeah. Let's do this. A strange flicker of approval passed through her eyes before she turned. With a wave of her hand, the platform in the center of the room hummed to life, weapons and armor shifting into position. The first trial was about to begin, and John had no idea if he would survive it. John barely had time to process what was happening before the chamber walls began to shift. The intricate carvings on the walls unraveled like liquid metal, reforming into something new, something ominous. The once serene patterns twisted into jagged edges, pulsing with an eerie red light. The hum of ancient machinery filled the air, growing louder as the ceremonial platform in the center of the room activated. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. Trial 1. The strength of the future king. John barely had time to react before the ground beneath him rumbled. A section of the floor slid open, and from it rose a colossal Xalorian warrior, easily twice his size. The creature's obsidian armor gleamed under the flickering lights, its 4 muscular arms flexing as it stepped forward. John's throat went dry. The Queen, who stood off to the side watching, spoke calmly. This is your first test. If you are to be the king of Xaloria, you must prove that you can stand against our greatest warriors. John blinked. Wait. What? The Xalorian warrior let out a guttural growl and charged. John barely threw himself to the side in time, feeling the rush of air as a massive fist slammed into the floor where he had been standing. The impact sent cracks spiderwebbing across the chamber, shaking the very walls. This was bad. Very, very bad. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He wasn't a soldier. He was a diplomat. He had 0 experience fighting super-strong, 4-armed aliens. What was he supposed to do? Talk his way out of this. The warrior came at him again, swinging a massive, club-like arm. This time, John had no choice but to dodge closer, slipping under the warrior's guard. He acted on instinct, using the momentum to slam his elbow into the warrior's ribs. It was like hitting a wall. The Xalorian didn't even flinch. John stumbled back, shaking out his arm in pain. Okay, That was dumb. The warrior let out a low chuckle, clearly enjoying this. It came at him again, and John barely managed to roll away, his heart pounding. He needed to think. Fast. He glanced around the chamber, looking for something, anything that could help. The platform behind him still held ceremonial weapons, but they were too far away. The queen stood still, watching with an unreadable expression. No one was going to help him. John realized something then. This wasn't about winning. It was about surviving. He didn't need to beat the warrior. He just needed to last long enough to prove he wasn't weak. The warrior lunged again, but this time, John didn't run. Instead, he ducked low and grabbed a loose fragment of metal from the cracked floor. As the warrior swung, John twisted at the last second, using the fragment to deflect the attack just enough to send the warrior off balance. The Xalorian stumbled, just slightly, but it was enough. John seized the opening. He drove his knee into the warrior's midsection, then twisted and used all his strength to slam the jagged metal against the warrior's back. The impact made the warrior stagger. It growled in frustration but didn't go down. However, the shift in momentum was all John needed. He took several quick steps back, breathing hard, his body aching. The warrior paused, then stepped back as well. There was a long silence, then the mechanical voice spoke again. Trial 1 complete. John almost collapsed in relief. The warrior straightened, his expression no longer hostile. Instead, he let out a low, approving grunt before stepping back into the shadows. The ground shifted once more, and he disappeared as if he had never been there. John wiped sweat from his brow, his hands still shaking. He turned toward the queen, expecting some kind of reaction. She stepped forward, her golden eyes studying him. "You did not fight to win," she observed. John let out a weak laugh. "Yeah, because I knew I couldn't." For the first time, the queen's expression softened. "And yet, you survived." John exhaled, shaking his head. "Barely." She tilted her head slightly, her silver hair catching the light. "You are not like the warriors of my people. You lack their strength, their training. And yet you endure." John let out a breath. "So, does that mean I passed?" The queen didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step closer, her gaze locked onto his. For the first time, John felt something different in the way she looked at him. Not just curiosity, but something else. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Yes, you passed." Before John could even fully absorb that answer, the chamber began shifting once more. The walls pulsed with energy, and the mechanical voice returned. Trial 2, the mind of the future king. John let out a long, suffering sigh. Of course, there's another one. The chamber began to shift again. The walls, which had just been solid stone moments ago, rippled like liquid metal. Patterns rearranged themselves, glowing symbols emerging from the floor and floating into the air. John barely had time to catch his breath before the deep mechanical voice spoke once more. Trial 2, the mind of the future king. John tensed, his pulse still racing from the previous fight. He wasn't sure what to expect this time. Another warrior. A puzzle. Some kind of mental test. His muscles ached, his breath came in shallow gasps, but there was no time to rest. He knew now that every challenge in this so-called path of kings was meant to test his worthiness. The queen remained still, watching him with the same calculating gaze she had before. She gave no hints, no warnings. This was his test alone. The floor beneath him shifted again, and suddenly, he wasn't in the same chamber anymore. The space around him melted away, replaced by something strange. John blinked. He was no longer standing in a room. Instead, he was floating. Stars stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no up, no down, just an infinite void of space with swirling galaxies and cosmic clouds in the distance. For a brief moment, it was beautiful. Then, the realization set in. He wasn't just floating. He was falling. A rush of panic shot through him, as he felt the weightlessness take hold. His arms flailed as he tumbled forward, a sickening feeling in his gut. This wasn't real. He knew that much, but it felt real. A voice echoed in his mind, not the mechanical one. This was something different, something familiar. Find your anchor or be lost forever. John's breath caught in his throat. His anchor. What did that mean? The endless stars around him began to shift, forming shapes, images, memories. He saw his home on Earth, the skyline of New London, the diplomatic ships he had spent years aboard. Faces flickered through the void. His friends, his crewmates, his family. Then they started to distort, twisting into something unrecognizable. His surroundings weren't just illusions. They were testing his mind, his sense of reality. John gritted his teeth. If this was a test, he had to think. He forced himself to focus. The moment he had entered this trial, he had still been standing in the Xalorian palace. That meant none of this was real. He was being manipulated, drawn into a vision designed to break his mind. That meant there had to be a way out. He steadied his breathing, pushing past the panic. He focused on something real, the last thing he had seen before entering this test. The Queen, her golden eyes, the way she had been watching him. That was real. As soon as he concentrated on her image, the void around him shuddered. The swirling stars flickered, as if something was resisting his focus. The distorted images of Earth and his past fractured, like a mirror breaking. Yes, the voice murmured in his mind. You begin to understand. John clenched his fists. The more he focused on what was real, the weaker the illusion became. Then, suddenly, he wasn't falling anymore. The cosmic void shattered around him like glass, and he found himself standing back in the chamber. His heart pounded as the sense of weightlessness faded, his feet firmly planted on the floor. He let out a breath of relief. The test was over. He had broken free. The Queen stepped forward, her gaze sharper than before. She studied him as if trying to see inside his mind. You resisted the illusions, she said. Few do. John exhaled. Is that your way of saying I passed? The Queen didn't smile, but there was something almost impressed in her eyes. Yes, you saw through the deception. You held on to reality. John shook his head, still trying to shake off the strange, lingering feeling of the trial. That was intense. The Queen tilted her head slightly. It was a test of your mind. Strength is not enough to rule. A true leader must be able to distinguish truth from illusion, to see beyond fear and deception. John rubbed his temples. Yeah, well, next time, a simple written test would be nice. For the first time, the Queen actually laughed. It was soft, but it was there. The sound caught John off guard, so much so that he almost forgot the danger he was in. Almost. The walls of the chamber shifted again. The light dimmed, and the mechanical voice spoke once more. Trial 3. The loyalty of the future king. John stiffened. His stomach twisted. This one felt different. The Queen's expression changed too. The amusement in her eyes faded, replaced by something else. A warning. John swallowed hard. He had a very, very bad feeling about what was coming next. The chamber dimmed, shadows stretching unnaturally as the air grew thick with tension. The flickering lights overhead cast eerie patterns across the floor, shifting like the surface of a restless sea. The mechanical voice returned, deeper this time, carrying an unmistakable weight. Trial 3. The loyalty of the future king. John's pulse quickened. He had barely made it through the last 2 trials, and now he was being tested for loyalty. Loyalty to whom? The Queen? The Xalorian Empire? Humanity? His gut told him this was going to be different from the physical combat and mind games he had faced so far. The floor beneath him split apart with a slow, grinding noise. A platform rose from the depths, carrying 2 figures bound in glowing restraints. John's heart stopped cold when he saw who they were. Commander Elias Ward and Lieutenant Sarah Keene, two members of the human delegation, his allies, his friends. The restraints binding them pulsed with a faint golden energy, Xalorian in design, shimmering with the unmistakable hum of advanced technology. The two officers looked battered but unharmed, their uniforms torn, their eyes sharp with confusion and concern. They saw John, and Sarah's expression twisted in shock. "John," she rasped, struggling against her bindings. "What the hell is going on?" John turned to the Queen, his stomach twisting with dread. "Why are they here?" The Queen's gaze was unreadable, her golden eyes reflecting the glow of the restraints. She took a slow step forward, her silver hair glinting in the dim light. "You have passed the trials of strength and mind," she said, her voice cool and composed. "But a king's greatest test is his loyalty. A ruler must be steadfast, unyielding in their dedication to their people." John narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly does that mean?" The Queen lifted a hand, and a holographic display materialized in the air beside her. It showed a contract, written in the flowing, elegant script of the Xalorian language. Though he couldn't read it, he already knew what it said. A royal vow, a declaration of loyalty. "To rule beside me, you must pledge your allegiance to Xaloria," the Queen said. "Swear to uphold our laws. Swear that this empire, not Earth, will be your home. Swear that you are willing to forsake humanity and serve only me." John's breath caught. His mind reeled. The test wasn't about his survival. It wasn't even about proving his worth. It was about forcing him to choose. The Queen's expression remained unreadable, but John could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him like an iron shackle. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "How is this a test of loyalty? I was sent here as a diplomat, not a king, and I never chose to." "You did choose," the Queen interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "The moment you performed the sacred gesture, you sealed your fate. This is the final step." She turned to the restrained humans. "They are your past. They are your ties to Earth. If you refuse to renounce them, the Empire will never accept you. The nobles will revolt. Our enemies will see weakness." Her gaze flickered with something deeper, something hidden beneath her regal exterior. "And I will be forced to undo what has begun." John understood exactly what that meant. Undo what has begun. It meant Elias and Sarah wouldn't leave this room alive. His stomach turned to stone. "You can't be serious." The Queen met his gaze steadily. "I am always serious." Silence fell. The chamber walls pulsed like a living thing, the low hum of ancient machinery the only sound. John could feel the weight of 100 unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Sarah clenched her fists. "John," she said, her voice urgent, "don't do this. Whatever they're offering, it's a trap. You know that, right?" Elias, the older and more composed of the two, locked eyes with John. "She's testing you," he said, his voice calm despite the tension. "You don't have to play her game." But did he? John turned back to the Queen, searching for something, anything, that might hint at another way out. But her face remained impassive, giving nothing away. His mind raced. If he pledged himself to Xaloria, he would be sealing his fate, cutting himself off from Earth forever. His people would see him as a traitor, someone who had abandoned his own kind. But if he refused, Sarah and Elias would die. John felt the weight of his own heartbeat, his breath slow and uneven. He couldn't let them die. He couldn't. But the moment he spoke those words, the moment he swore fealty to Xaloria, he would never be able to take them back. He forced himself to think, to see beyond the trap laid before him. And then it hit him. Loyalty. The trial wasn't just about pledging loyalty to the Queen. It was about what loyalty truly meant. John lifted his chin and squared his shoulders. "A king's loyalty should never be forced," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "And it shouldn't be tested with the lives of others." The Queen's golden eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second. John took a slow step forward. "If I'm to be your king, then I won't be a ruler who abandons his people. And I won't be a ruler who kills for power." He turned, locking eyes with Sarah and Elias. "A true king protects his own. All of them." A long, heavy silence filled the chamber. Then the queen exhaled softly. She turned her gaze toward the floating contract, and with a flick of her fingers, it disintegrated into golden embers. John blinked. He hadn't expected that. The queen tilted her head slightly, watching him with something new in her expression. "Interesting," she murmured. The golden restraints holding Sarah and Elias vanished, dissolving into thin air. They stumbled forward, rubbing their wrists in confusion, looking at John in disbelief. The queen stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You were right," she said, just loud enough for John to hear. "Loyalty cannot be forced. And perhaps that is what this empire needs." John exhaled, his hands still shaking. He had gambled everything on that answer, and somehow it had worked. The mechanical voice spoke once more. "Trial 3, complete." John felt his knees go weak. But before he could even catch his breath, the walls of the chamber began to shift again, the air growing colder. And in that moment, he realized something. The trials were not over yet. The chamber trembled again, its shifting walls glowing with eerie light. But this time, something was different. The air was thick, humming with an energy that pressed against John's skin like an unseen force. He had barely recovered from the last trial, his pulse still erratic from the weight of his decision, but he knew there was no time to rest. The queen stood before him, her golden eyes locked onto his. There was something new in her gaze, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of curiosity, of respect even. But there was something else too, something buried deep beneath her regal composure. She lifted her hand, and the room responded. The walls shifted into mirrored surfaces, stretching in every direction, turning the chamber into an infinite reflection of itself. John saw himself 1,000 times over, standing in the center of an endless void of distorted versions of himself. Each reflection moved slightly differently, as if they were not just reflections, but possibilities, alternate versions of him. Then the mechanical voice rumbled through the space once more. Trial 4, the truth of the future king. John inhaled sharply. The truth. He didn't like the sound of that. The queen stepped forward, her reflection multiplying infinitely with every movement. "Every ruler must know who they truly are," she said, her voice soft but firm. "No lies, no illusions, no masks." John frowned. "I don't wear a mask." The queen didn't argue. Instead, she gestured toward the mirrors, and suddenly, the reflections began to change. John's breath caught as he watched the shifting images of himself. They no longer mirrored his movements. Instead, they played out moments from his past. One mirror showed him as a child, standing outside his home on Earth, watching the colony ships leave for distant worlds. His younger self reached out, longing to be part of something greater. Another mirror showed him as a cadet, standing at attention as his commanding officer told him he would never be more than a negotiator, a mere diplomat with no true power. A third reflection showed him now, standing before the queen, but his expression was different, darker, filled with something that made John's stomach twist. Regret. Doubt. "What is this?" he murmured, stepping forward. "The truth," the queen answered simply. John turned to another mirror, where he saw a version of himself that had accepted the Xalorian throne without question, standing proudly beside the queen, wearing the ceremonial armor of her people. In another, he saw himself walking away, turning his back on the Xalorians, on the queen, on everything. A version of himself that had chosen Earth over everything else. The images continued to shift, each one showing a different path, a different future, and suddenly, John felt something he hadn't before. Doubt. Not about his choice in the last trial. He knew he had done the right thing, but about himself. Who was he? Was he the diplomat who had simply stumbled into a throne he never wanted? Was he the warrior who had fought to survive in trials he had no business passing? Was he the leader the Xalorians now looked to? Or was he none of those things? The mirrors blurred again, and then they spoke. His own voice echoed from the reflections, but they weren't his thoughts. They were whispers from the different versions of himself. You don't belong here. You are weak. You are not a king. You never will be. John clenched his fists. His heart pounded. The queen remained silent, watching him, waiting. The whispers grew louder. The reflections warped, distorting into twisted versions of himself, each one glaring at him, judging him. The weight of their gazes pressed against his chest like a crushing force. And then a new voice spoke. His own. But this time, it wasn't from a reflection. It was from within. I am John Carter. The whispers faltered. The mirrors shuddered. I don't have all the answers. The reflections flickered, some shattering like broken glass. I never wanted to be a king. I never asked for this. The images trembled, warping, distorting further. But I am here, and I will not let others decide who I am. A crack split through the entire mirrored chamber. The reflections collapsed inward, the images shattering one by one, until nothing remained but darkness. And then, light. John exhaled, realizing that he was back in the original chamber, standing once again before the queen. The walls were solid once more. The mirrors were gone. The queen studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You faced yourself, she said, and you did not run. John swallowed hard. His body felt heavy, his mind exhausted. But he had made it. Trial 4, complete. The mechanical voice spoke again, but this time there was something different in its tone, almost as if the machine itself had not expected him to pass. The queen tilted her head slightly, her gaze more curious than ever. Then she did something John didn't expect. She stepped closer. Too close. John's breath hitched as she reached out, gently, carefully, and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. You are not like the rulers before, she murmured. Not like those who sought power, nor those who feared it. John wasn't sure what to say. The touch of her hand was light, but the weight of her words was heavier than anything he had faced so far. For the first time, the queen looked uncertain. Perhaps, she whispered, almost too softly to hear, I was wrong about you. Before John could ask what she meant, the walls of the chamber shuddered violently, the floor beneath them shaking as if the entire palace had just been struck by something massive. A deep echoing boom rang through the halls, followed by the unmistakable blaring of an alarm. The queen's expression shifted instantly. The softness vanished, replaced by sharp focus. She turned toward the entrance, where a Xalorian warrior rushed in, his armor smeared with dust and smoke. Your Majesty, the warrior said urgently, bowing slightly before locking eyes with John. The palace is under attack. John barely had time to react before another explosion shook the chamber, sending cracks running through the ceiling. The queen's jaw tightened. So, she murmured, our enemies have finally made their move. John took a deep breath, his exhaustion pushed aside by a surge of adrenaline. The trials were over. Now, the real fight was beginning. The ground shook violently as another explosion rippled through the palace walls. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling, filling the chamber with thick smoke. The once grand hall, where John had just endured his trials, was now a battleground. The air was alive with distant shouts, the clang of weapons, and the eerie hum of Xalorian energy weapons firing in rapid succession. John barely had time to react before the queen turned sharply, her golden eyes burning with intensity. She no longer carried the detached calm of a ruler observing a test. This was different. This was personal. We need to move, she said. John nodded, already scanning for an exit. The mechanical voice that had governed the trials had gone silent, its presence drowned out by the chaos beyond the chamber doors. The moment the heavy doors slid open, John was met with the sight of battle. Xalorian warriors clashed with dark-armored figures, enemies who bore no royal insignia, their weapons sleek and unfamiliar. Rebels. John barely had time to process it before the Queen grabbed his arm and pulled him to the side, pressing him into the shadows of a crumbling pillar. Two of the enemy soldiers rushed past them, unaware of their presence. The Queen turned to John, her voice low but urgent. "This attack is no accident," she murmured. "Someone planned this carefully. They'd waited until the trials were nearly complete. Until you." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Until we were at our most vulnerable." John frowned. "You think this is about me?" The Queen's gaze flickered. "I think this is about the throne." She wasn't wrong. From the moment John had unknowingly proposed to her, he had disrupted the balance of power. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was a threat to those who wanted control. Whoever was behind this attack wasn't just targeting the Queen. They wanted to stop the marriage, stop his ascension, and take the throne for themselves. John took a breath. "Then we need to get you somewhere safe." The Queen gave him a sharp look. "You are not my bodyguard, John Carter." John exhaled. "Yeah. Well, right now, I'm the only person standing between you and a whole lot of people who want you dead." Before the Queen could respond, another explosion rocked the palace, this one much closer. The impact sent a shockwave through the corridor, knocking them both off balance. John hit the ground hard. The breath ripped from his lungs. His ears rang from the blast. When he pushed himself up, he realized the Queen was no longer beside him. Panic surged through him. He twisted around, searching through the smoke and rubble. Then, through the haze, he saw her. A figure loomed over her, clad in the same dark armor as the rebels. The enemy soldier raised a weapon, its energy core glowing an ominous red. John didn't think, he just moved. With pure instinct, he threw himself forward, slamming into the attacker with full force. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground. The weapon skittered across the floor, the glow fading as it powered down. John rolled to his feet just in time to see the Queen spring up, her movements fluid and precise. Before the enemy soldier could react, she twisted and drove a dagger straight into their chest. A swift and lethal strike. The attacker crumpled. John exhaled sharply. "You could have warned me you had a knife." The Queen glanced at him. "You didn't ask." There was no time to argue. More enemies were approaching, their footsteps echoing down the corridor. John could see it now. This wasn't just an attack. This was an organized coup. The rebels had infiltrated the palace, their numbers overwhelming the royal guard. If they didn't act fast, the throne would be lost before dawn. The Queen's expression hardened. "We need to reach the royal chamber. There is a failsafe, a control that can override the palace defenses, but we must get there before they do." John didn't need convincing. "Then let's go." They moved quickly, weaving through the crumbling corridors, avoiding enemy patrols where they could and fighting when they had no choice. John wasn't a soldier, but survival had been drilled into him through the trials. He fought smart, using his environment to his advantage, dodging, striking, disarming. He wasn't as fast or as strong as the Queen, but he was resourceful. They reached the royal chamber just as the doors were forced open from the other side. The Queen froze. Standing there, at the head of the invading force, was someone John never expected. A Xalorian noble, dressed in ceremonial robes, his golden armor polished and pristine. But his expression was anything but noble. His eyes gleamed with cold ambition, and behind him, his soldiers stood ready, their weapons aimed. John knew that face. He had seen it in the throne room before the trials began. One of the Queen's closest advisors, a voice of reason, or so it had seemed. Betrayal. The noble stepped forward, his expression calm, almost bored. "You should not have made it this far, human." The Queen's gaze darkened. "You were always a coward," she said coldly. The noble didn't deny it. "Cowards live longer than fools." He gestured toward John. "But I must admit, I did not expect him to pass the trials. I underestimated him. John clenched his jaw. Yeah, well, that makes two of us. The noble sighed. It doesn't matter now. The throne is mine, and you are both out of time. John's mind raced. The noble wasn't wrong. They were outnumbered. The queen might be a formidable warrior, but even she couldn't fight an entire army alone. And John, he was just one man. Then he saw it. The failsafe. A control panel embedded into the wall just behind the noble. It was a long shot, but if he could activate it, it might be enough to turn the tide. John looked at the queen, his meaning clear. Cover me. She didn't hesitate. With a single fluid motion, she lunged forward, drawing the attention of the noble and his soldiers. The moment their focus shifted, John ran. Bullets and energy blasts whizzed past him. The heat of an explosion seared against his skin, but he didn't stop. He reached the panel, fingers flying over the controls. The noble realized what was happening too late. Stop him, he roared. Too late. John slammed his fist against the final command. The palace trembled as the failsafe activated. Energy barriers sprang to life, cutting off the rebel forces, separating them from John and the queen. Defense systems rebooted, turning against the invading soldiers. The tide had shifted. The queen turned, her eyes locking onto the nobles. You have lost. The noble's expression twisted in fury. This isn't over. John exhaled. Yeah, I think it is. The noble vanished into the chaos, retreating as the battle turned against him. Silence fell. John turned to the queen. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They had fought together, survived together. And now they stood at the threshold of a new future. The queen stepped closer. John Carter, she said softly, do you still wish to leave? John hesitated, looking around at the throne, the palace, the life he never chose but had somehow become part of. Then he made his choice, and this time it wasn't by accident.